good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. My name is Marcus Grodi, your host for this weekly live program, and it's always a pleasure to be here with you, and especially on this episode, this first episode of each month in which we call Open Line, in which I have the opportunity to invite back to the program previous guests. They've already told you their story, though he'll remind you a bit of it, but they're here to answer more of your questions and emails about specifically the guest journey or other aspects of the journey of following Jesus Christ home to his church, maybe that you weren't able to get through before. And before I mention tonight's guests, I want to right away give you the phone numbers, because as soon as we get phone calls and emails, we'll begin answering your questions. So if you're inside North America, give us a call at 1-800-221-9460, or outside North America, you can call us at 205-271-2980, or if you'd like to send us an email, you can contact us by writing journeyhome, one word, at EWTN.com. Our guest tonight is Dale Ahlquist, the founder, editor of the, is it the American Chesterton Society?
The American Chesterton Society.
I want to make sure I get it right.
That's all right.
But you've been on the program at least a couple times, and it's great to have you back, because G.K. Chesterton had a big impact in Dale's journey, and he'll talk later about not only how that brought him into the church, but is now putting the food on the table, right? I mean, that's not the main reason,
No.
but the reality is you were able to give your life to this work, which is very good, and it's glad to have you back. But the guests will also recognize Dale for the other programs he does here on G.K. Chesterton. He's in a number of series, and that's why Dale is back here at EWTN this week. So we wanted to make sure and schedule him to be on the program. You may never have read G.K. Chesterton. He's not necessarily on the list of reading at the local public school anymore. He ought to be, especially at local Catholic schools, but he's not always there. But he's one of these authors that is worthwhile to rediscover and to add to your reading list and move it right to the top, because there's lots of great stuff there. Dale, welcome to the Journey Home
Thank
program.
you, Marcus.
It's great to have you here.
Nice to be back.
And before I begin with the first question, I'm going to hold up that magazine, Gilbert Magazine, and what's it say there? Outlining Sanity.
Outlining
right?
Sanity.
Okay, great. Maybe I'll ask you later why that's there. But let me ask you to begin by giving us a quick summary of your journey to remind the audience.
Well, Marcus, I was raised as a Baptist in a very wonderful, devout Christian home. My parents, very sincere believers, and I had a very good childhood and a very good upbringing, very solidly based in the Bible. And I grew up memorizing a lot of scripture. I memorized whole books of the Bible. And in high school and college was a general gadfly of making people aware of my faith. But I, at a certain point, was a big C.S. Lewis fan, loved his Christian apologetics and his way of defending the Christian faith, and someone recommended to me that I read G.K. Chesterton. I had never heard of G.K. Chesterton, and this person said to me, well, you know, if you read Chesterton, you won't even need to read C.S. Lewis, because everything that's in C.S. Lewis is in G.K. Chesterton, only it's better. Well, this was an astounding comment to me, and it made me think, but it didn't make me run and pick up a book by Chesterton. It wasn't until a few years later, on my honeymoon,
Really?
that I read my first Chesterton book. And my wife and I were honeymooning in Rome. And we were there on the day the Pope was shot in 1981. And so I had a very dramatic beginning to my marriage, but I was also reading G.K. Chesterton while my wife was reading Les Miserables. True story. And but I've been married to Chesterton as long as I've been married to my wife, because I began an immediate love affair with this writer. I realized as I read The Everlasting Man that that was the first book, which is not the book I'd recommend to anybody to start with.
We'll go there later, but that's
But it's a phenomenal book. But I realized as I read it that my whole education had been a fraud. There was so much there about history and the whole approach to every discipline that was so fresh and so new and so true. It had such a ring of truth to it that I knew that I'd met an astonishing writer, and I went on to get my hands on as many Chesterton books as I could, and eventually went on to do a master's thesis on Chesterton, and eventually was driven to the point where I wanted other people to start discovering this writer. I said, this is a life-changing writer, and a writer that is being kept a secret, and unjustly so. There's all these lies being taught out there in the academy, and here's the antidote. Here's the truth, and here's someone who can actually answer all those modern thinkers on their own terms. And so I started the American Chesterton Society, and I actually had not even become a Catholic yet. I was always avoiding that part of Chesterton for as long as possible. And at a certain point, something gets to you.
Yeah.
And what happened with me, it was very funny. I had heard that someone was actually wanting to promote a cause for Chesterton sainthood. And a lot of the Catholic Chestertonians who I knew were very worried about that, because they thought, well, that's going to turn off all our Protestant friends to G.K. Chesterton if he were canonized. And me, as the token Protestant in the group, said, on the contrary. I said, if you make Chesterton a saint, I'll become a Catholic. And they didn't take the bait. I had to go through normal channels to get into the Catholic Church. But what's interesting is when I first heard of Chesterton, the whole idea of him becoming a saint or being declared a saint, I had an instant understanding of the communion of saints. Raised as a Baptist, the saints are absolutely not part of that experience whatsoever. We shun that idea. But it was truly instantaneous. I understood that what a saint does is he doesn't get in the way of your relationship with Christ. He brings you closer to Christ. That's what the saints do. And I also understood if there's anyone I wanted to intercede for me, it would be someone like G.K. Chesterton, because he already established the fact that he understood me. So it was, and many other things, but that was one of the first things that really opened me up to realizing that the Catholic Church might be right.
When you look at Chesterton's own story, it seems like his actual conversion to the church lagged himself quite a bit later from his own convictions in that area. Is that true?
Yeah, very true, very true. He was defending the Catholic Church long before he actually entered the church himself. In fact, he even described himself at one point as standing at the door and ushering other people into the church without having entered it himself.
Well, orthodoxy would be a good example.
Yeah, orthodoxy is a good example. It's a book that is very much a defense of the Catholic faith, but he wrote it long before he was Catholic.
That's right.
There's only one line in that book where he indicates that he's not Catholic yet. Otherwise, it's a complete defense of the Catholic Church.
When you look back at the writings of Chesterton that you were reading during this time, and here you're publishing a magazine before you're Catholic, I don't know if I'd want to give you this, describe you in the same way that Lewis did, about kicking and screaming, in that sense, in his own conversion to Christianity for him, but for you to be the Catholic Church. What were the 2 or 3 things that Chesterton had to say that in the end were the coup de grace that said, okay, I must become Catholic?
First of all, his description of conversion started to ring true. He says there's 3 stages you go through, that a convert goes through. The first stage is when you decide you're going to be fair to the Catholic Church. And he says there is no being fair to the Catholic Church. You're either for it or against it. There is no middle ground. When you stop kicking against it, you start feeling yourself being drawn towards it. And I knew that was happening to me. And then he said the second stage is discovering the Catholic Church. For the first time, you're learning all these things that you didn't know before. And I was starting to do that. I was starting to read the Church Fathers and realizing, as someone who loved the Bible, that their commentary on Scripture was far and away deeper and more wonderful than anything I'd read by a modern biblical commentator. So there's that second stage of discovering. It's like being in a country discovering exotic new animals and flowers that you never knew existed. And then comes the third stage of conversion, which is running away from the Catholic Church, doing everything you can to to avoid making that last step, because you know it's going to change your life completely. You know you cannot go back. You have to face every question and come up with an answer for it, but you know that the last answer is going to have to be yes, and humble yourself and enter in.
I'd forgotten that about his 3 stages, because in our work with the Coming Home Network, we have it divided up in stages. We call it the inquiry stage, when you're just kind of being open for the first time in your life, and then you get so far that now you're on the journey, when you're really learning to discover and understand the church. You can no longer go back and be the way you were because you discover the truth. Then you get so far, and then we call the no man's land. It's like, wait a second here, I got to put the brakes on because of what the conversion is going to mean for me. And I'm wondering, looking at Chesterton in those stages, he came into the church, but there's a sad part of his writing career in a way, that when he came this far, rising so high in appreciation amongst literary folk, that when he got this far, all of a sudden he started getting pushed out. Talk about that, because the white martyrdom of Chesterton.
Sure. I mean, Chesterton was the toast of literary London in the early 20th century, and was an astounding writer that made a great impression because of his use of paradox and his great wit, his great mind, his ability to talk about everything, and take on the great thinkers of his day, and have the fortitude and the bravery to call them heretics, and yet they didn't know what it was he was defending. And when he started defending Christianity, everyone thought it was kind of cute that he would, that someone so smart would actually defend Christianity. But then they were shocked to find out that he defended Christianity because he actually was a Christian and believed it himself. And they were able to put up with that, and because he was still turning out very interesting literature and writing novels that made a great impression and were still very popular. And then he wrote these Father Brown stories, these detective stories, that again were very popular and did something, just changed the course of detective fiction altogether. Up until that time, detective fiction had all been Sherlock Holmes and bad imitations of Sherlock Holmes. And then when Father Brown came along, he's this quiet, dumpy little detective that no one, he's a priest for one thing. No one even notices priests. No one believes that priests know anything. And the fact is, he understands the criminal mind and he can figure out what happened. And yet, the Father Brown stories were very popular, and yet it wasn't until after his conversion where suddenly they were suspicious of the Father Brown stories as being too sectarian, as if they had never figured out before his conversion that Father Brown was a Catholic priest.
Yeah, and then we get to the point where, as sadly so many in the audience maybe never even heard of G.K.
Exactly,
Chesterton.
right. He was completely put out of the colleges and universities. Up until the 1940s and 50s, he was still standard reading material in most colleges and universities.
There it's interesting. Let me give you another parallel, and I'd like you to talk about this too, is that with Schumacher, right, who many of our audience might remember for his book,
Small is Beautiful.
Small is Beautiful, a bestseller back in the 25, 30 years ago, of this whole sustainable economy movement, small farming, simple living. There's Schumacher societies everywhere, and a great number of them have no idea that Schumacher was a Catholic convert, who connected mostly to the writings of Chesterton. But one thing I find interesting about his writing, it was a decision he made in that book, was he used a religion as the example of what he was trying to say, but he chose Buddhism instead of Christianity. And so a lot of people figured he's this ecumenical, but I think he did so because he recognized that if he'd have chose Christianity in his culture, no one would have listened.
Especially if he had chosen Catholicism.
No one would have listened. They would have written him off just like they did Chesterton and Belloc.
Right.
And the connection here is Chesterton as a maker of converts. Talk about that aspect of his work.
Oh, absolutely. I know that many guests on your show have invoked Chesterton as being influential in their own conversion stories, and certainly Chesterton led me to the doors of the Catholic Church. But it's so amazing how now, more than ever, through his lifetime, he was a maker of converts. But now more than ever, people are rediscovering this writer, and they come to Chesterton for many different reasons. in the academic world, which is probably the most interesting and hardest one to break, they approach Chesterton because of his literary criticism. He is a very colorful and original writer when it comes to analyzing the Victorian writers and Shakespeare as well. And so, and they know he can turn a phrase really well. And so they read his literary criticism of Charles Dickens and Robert Louis Stevenson and Tolstoy and Shakespeare. And they see some really fresh and original literary criticism, much different from what they're used to reading. And then they fall in love with the writer and they say, well, I want to read something else he's written. And then they just discover the rest of his books. And then they start finding their way to the Catholic faith that way. And that's what's so amazing about Chesterton. He's written such a variety of literature, and there's all these doors to discover him. People come to him through his detective fiction, through his writing on economics. It's a very powerful way he reaches people who have no interest in the Catholic faith whatsoever, but they like his ideas on economics. They like his detective fiction or his literary criticism or his interesting fantastical novels like The Man Who Was Thursday.
Yep.
And then there are some, and this, of course, the huge segment, who, because of his connection with C.S. Lewis, and these are the evangelical Christians like I was, who read orthodoxy and read The Everlasting Man, because they know how influential those books were on C.S. Lewis and his wonderful apologetics, his defense of miracles and of the resurrection. And then they want to discover more of Chesterton, and they find their way to that Catholic center of his writing.
All right. Well, we have an email, and this is open line, so not all these questions are going to have to deal with Chesterton, right? That was kind of the introduction here.
Chesterton says there's no such thing as a different subject, so it probably does have something to do with Chesterton.
Yeah, he was the man. He was the master of syllogism, right?
He was master of everything.
Right.
When it comes to English writing. Yes, absolutely.
Right. He always is. Okay. Well, let's take this first email. This is Barbara from Henderson, Nevada. I think that's Nevada. Thank you, Marcus, for your wonderful program. This question is for you and your guest. As a cradle Catholic, I have absolutely no idea of how to respond to other Christians when they ask me, quote, have you accepted Jesus Christ as your personal Savior, and are you saved, unquote. My response is that I accepted Jesus as my personal Savior when I was baptized. Is there more that I should be saying? Thank you, Barbara.
Good one.
From a Baptist background,
yes,
there you go.
I used to ask people that question.
She speaks,
yes,
right?
Yes. Chesterton has a line about that Protestants generally have this assurance about being saved, whereas Catholics do not. Very frankly, they are still working out their salvation with fear and trembling, which is what the Apostle Paul tells us to do.
Yeah.
And there is no account of any biblical writer saying, I am saved. And it's something that was added by that evangelical culture, that phrase, that phraseology. And so we have to remind them of that idea that we have to still work out our salvation with fear and trembling. But in that next verse that the Apostle Paul says is, for God is at work in you, both to will and to work his purpose. So there is the ultimate paradox, or the sense of paradox, that salvation is partly our involvement and God's involvement. That grace is something that we have to accept. We have to do something, and then we have to try to remain in that state of grace. And that is where the fear and trembling comes in.
And I would say that an awful lot of Catholics just don't realize and appreciate the fact that mystical theology, Catholic mystical theology, what John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila and the Little Flower we're all talking about, is a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. That's
Amen.
what mystical theology is all about.
Amen.
Growing in union with Jesus. That's personal relationship.
Right.
And so the whole understanding of spirituality from a Catholic perspective is that.
Yes.
And that's what we're growing in the different stages of the spiritual life, to have a more deeply personal relationship with Christ. So we do have. And of course, there's the Eucharist.
Yes.
I mean, about how personal can you get there?
And again, the Apostle Paul says that I may know him, and that I may know Christ and him crucified. That's the Catholic personal relationship with the.
I also find it interesting, we'll go to this caller in a moment, but that it's interesting that this whole idea of the personal relationship with Jesus, this have you accepted him as your personal savior? That's a code phrase that became so popular in evangelical America, that whole movement grew at a time in America, almost at the time of Chesterton's conversion. It began about that time, in that whole Princeton movement with Hodge and that whole group. And I often wonder whether at the end of the 19th century, it seemed that a large majority of the writers were presuming that Protestantism was on its last legs. This was it.
Right.
The only defender of the scriptures at the end of the 19th century was primarily the Catholic Church, because most of Protestantism had bought into the liberal German. But then you have these Chesterton and Belloc, as the great writers, this revival of Catholicism, and all of a sudden at the same time, you end up with this new tact in Protestantism, which led to the evangelical movement.
Right.
And even wonder, it'd be interesting to study how much of that influence of Belloc and Chesterton and then C.S. Lewis and others had an influence on that evangelical revival.
That would be interesting, yeah.
So something to think about. But let's take our next caller. This is Jackie from California. Hello, Jackie. What's your question?
Hi. Yeah. Years ago, I read a book, and I don't know the name, that after Chesterton had visited the United States, and his comment was that if the United States continues along its way of losing its Christianity, it's going to be more depraved than Europe is today. And I'd like to know which book it was and any comments.
Thank you, Jackie.
The book he wrote after his trip to America was called What I Saw in America. And it's available from Ignatius Press in volume 21 of the collected works of G.K. Chesterton.
Which I'll say right now is a great blessing that they've reissued all of his books.
Well, they're coming out slowly. They've got about 24 of the projected 45 volumes.
Wow,
he was just a phenomenally.
Now, what year was that book?
It was 1921 was that visit to the United States, and that book would have been published in 1922. However, that's not where that comment is made that she's talking about. That was actually in a newspaper column he wrote that's been reprinted several times. It was a newspaper column he wrote in his own newspaper called GK's Weekly. And in that he has this amazing comment for kind of addressing the Red Scare and our fear about communism. And what Chesterton says is the next great heresy will be an attack on morality, especially sexual morality. And he says the madness of tomorrow is not in Moscow, it is in Manhattan.
Whoa. Now, when was that said?
That was about 1925 when he said that.
Oh,
yeah.
Interesting. Well, that prophecy is certainly come true in spades.
One of Chesterton's many prophecies that is so true.
That's really amazing. And it's interesting that he was seeing, as I mentioned earlier, about this kind of rebirth of evangelicalism that came because what he was seeing in America was really the dying of all these churches and the struggles and the fragmentation and as so many of these denominations had seen their 100, 150-year, 200-year deadness. And,
he talked about the what he called the biblical fundamentalists, or what he called the Bible worshiping sects, and what he liked about these Protestants was how honest they were, and how they were very much defenders of the truth. But he said the criticism of them was that and this is of the sola scriptura people is that he said, I could understand someone looking at a Catholic procession coming down the aisle with someone holding up the sacred scrolls, and someone else holding up the candle, and someone else holding up a crucifix, and someone else wearing the robes and the mitre and all that stuff, and say, it's all bosh. But what I cannot understand is someone saying, those scrolls are right, but everything else is bosh. Yeah. Because what he's understanding there is that it all comes from the Catholic Church. The Bible, too, came from the Catholic Church. And what they've done is they've just selected the one thing that they like and they've rejected the rest, and that is what every heresy is. It's just a choosing of a particular narrow truth and rejecting the rest of it.
Actually, that's an interesting analogy because you're not just the picking and choosing, but you look at some of these other sects, the what would you call them? The clubs that rose in the 20s, 30s,
Right.
and 40s, they weren't so much committed to that book, but they were committed to the robes.
Yes, right, okay.
The other aspects
Some
of
other
Catholicism,
thing they chose from the faith.
the
yeah.
ritual. They love the ritual. So they'll throw out the faith, throw out
Yeah.
the books, but they'll keep the ritual, the fellowship. How good and how pleasant it is for brothers to dwell together in unity. They'll keep all of that, but not the morality,
Right.
not the faith, and not our divine creator.
Another good example, yes.
Yeah, very
much.
interesting. Let's take a break. We've got some emails and some phone calls waiting for us. We'll be back in just a moment with your questions for Dale Ahlquist. Welcome back to the Journey Home. Our guest tonight is Dale Ahlquist. He is the founder and president of the Gilbert magazine, which is published by the American Chesterton Society, which I've forgotten that you actually had started before you were Catholic. And so that, in other words, emphasizes the fact that Chesterton is a man for all Christians. It really is. And in fact, why don't we go to this email, because it brings out some of those issues about why he is someone that we need to remember, though we don't always. This comes from Robbie. Mr. Grodi, great job. Thank you, Robbie. I only heard about Chesterton, but he's been on my get to know more list. So my question is, on what ground did schools and colleges shun away from Chesterton's work? Are we seeing a Chesterton comeback, especially in Catholic schools? And I want to qualify his question a little bit. Because, like Belloc, their movement was into more pro-Catholic apologetics in their later works. Were they ever a key part of any curriculum, whether it was secular or Catholic? So were they ever there and then shunned, or have they always been shunned?
Yeah, if you look back at early anthologies of poetry and English literature from the mid and early 20th century, Chesterton and Belloc will be in every one of them. Just their poems, their poetry alone is just great English literature. And then they were both master essayists, and just their style of using English rhetoric is something worth studying, so you'd find it in those English literature anthologies right up through the 1950s and possibly even a few 1960s, but then they just disappeared altogether. And frankly, they were anti-modern. They were against everything about the modern world in terms of certainly defending the Catholic Church, but also they wrote poems that rhymed, and and that was no longer the fashion. They defended a traditional morality. They defended tradition, period, and none of those things were in vogue anymore. And
it's sad when you look at the two of the key men that they did most of their fighting against are the ones,
Shaw and H.G. Wells, and those guys remained in print and remained the books that were being taught when there was an argument against those two writers and against their philosophies, and the students from the 60s and 70s and onwards were only hearing one side of that argument because they never got Belloc and Shaw and Chesterton's responses.
I think H.G. Wells, for one, that so few people realize what a major influence he was on the modern feminist movement, on Planned Parenthood, the founding of that whole anti-Victorian society. He was a key in that, and that we had the antidote.
Yeah, we had the antidote.
Chesterton and Belloc.
And one of H.G. Wells' most famous books is The Outline of History. The Everlasting Man was written specifically against that book.
Yeah.
They should be taught side by side.
Well, no. Everlasting Man should be taught.
The
Outline of History should be burned.
But to see how bad modern thinking is, Chesterton exposes it for what it is.
Yeah, that's right. I was thinking in relationship to that last question, then we're going to go to our next caller. If a person's never read, like he's on his to-do list, he's never read Chesterton, where should you begin?
Well, that's a great question, tough question, but go to our webpage, www.chesterton.org. That gives you a taste of Chesterton right there. Starts getting you in. Our magazine is designed for people to get Chesterton in small doses. It's also a great way to introduce Chesterton to college students because they're not getting Chesterton in college, and
Right.
the magazine is designed for that as well. I hate to say this, but the book that I wrote, The Apostle of Common Sense, is a good introduction to Chesterton.
It was designed for that.
That's what it was designed for, but I do hate to say it.
Yeah, well, I understand.
And I think these things are ways of getting people in. But if they start reading his essays, start reading some Father Brown stories, they're gonna start understanding his way of writing, so that they can get familiar with it, and then take on a book like Orthodoxy.
And I even encourage budding writers to take the advice of the lives and the writing style and the corpus of Belloc and Chesterton, as well as Dorothy Sayers and C.S. Lewis, who didn't only write one kind of book.
Yes.
They wrote a variety, because what happens is, see, somebody reads the Father Brown series just because they're detective stories, but then after a while, boy, I love this author, I want to find out more. And then they get into the apologetics.
Right.
That's same thing with Belloc. He had many novels. Dorothy Sayers writes all her wonderful detective stories, and then you get into Dante. I mean, that's the draw.
Yeah.
And we can learn a lot. Those who want to be writers is to have this wider breadth.
And Chesterton says defending Christianity, if it is true, means you have to be able to talk about anything and everything, because it's a truth that's relevant to everything.
All right, let's take our next caller, Beverly from Illinois. Hello, Beverly. What's your question for us?
Hi, how are you? I just wanted to tell you I enjoy your show very much.
Thank you.
How do you respond to Christians who say that Catholics pray to and through saints or statues, and this is worshiping idols instead of praying just to Jesus?
All right, thank you, Beverly, very much. Appreciate that.
Well,
Did you ever think that when you were a Baptist?
Oh yeah, of course, yeah. These idolaters, these Catholics, yes. Well, there's two answers to the question. First of all, you can respond to that person right away by saying, well, when I ask you to pray for me, or when you ask me to pray for you, why don't you just ask Jesus directly? Why do you ask me to pray for you? And why should I ask you to pray for me if I can just ask Jesus directly for help? And the answer is that most Protestants believe in intercessory prayer. They believe that it does do good for someone else to pray for you. And that's what we believe with the saints, that just like it says in the Epistle of James, the prayer of a righteous man has great power in its effects. And that's what we believe about the saints, that they are the righteous people and that their prayers do have great power in their effects. And also in Hebrews chapter 12, that we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses of the faith, and they do support our faith and uphold us in our faith. And so the idea of intercessory prayer is there for Protestants to understand. As far as idolatry means worshiping the statue rather than worshiping what the statue represents, or it means worshiping anything instead of worshiping the greater reality that's behind it. And no Catholic does that.
If they do, they're uninformed.
If they do, they're uninformed, and that's a different issue. But the idea is that every great piece of Catholic art is there to inspire us and to enhance our worship experience. And it's given us some of the greatest art in the history of the world.
That's right. Let's take this email, because we've got another caller waiting here. This comes from John C. in Corpus Christi, Texas. Dear Marcus and Dale, love your show and your wonderful topic. Why do you suppose that someone with such a keen mind as C.S. Lewis, who had such a Catholic theology, e.g. belief in purgatory, sacramental nature of marriage et al., didn't make the final leap, that is, convert to the Catholic faith? Many thanks for your comments, and may God bless. Thank you, John.
Chesterton wrote in a book on William Blake, the mystical poet of the 1600s. He said, Chesterton wrote this book on William Blake 10 years before he became Catholic himself, okay? And he said, if every man lived 1,000 years, every man would become either a pessimistic atheist or a member of the Catholic faith. Chesterton knew 10 years before he became a Catholic himself that there were really only ultimately two choices.
Yeah.
Utter denial of God or being a member of the Catholic faith. So everybody's either on one road or the other in Chesterton's mind. C.S. Lewis was on the right road. He just didn't live long enough. He had to live 1,000 years.
Yeah, God's timing. God's timing.
Yeah.
And you know, it is sad when you say that, because the one place, I'm not going to name the name of the particular city I'm thinking of, but when I visited Europe, I've seen places where you can see the trajectory of Protestantism. And once you throw off the authority of the church, the trustworthy authority of the hierarchy in union with Peter, you throw that off and you say the Bible alone, and then slowly that gets chipped away. I've been to some cities in what were once strong Catholic areas in Europe that are now decadent. And you can just see the trajectory of what happens.
Right.
You know, and even the best Christian groups, with all their sincerity, eventually it gets chipped away and the devil laughs. And really that's what Chesterton was saying.
Yes,
It's
yes.
either there or it's there.
Those are the two choices.
That's right.
Yes.
Let's take our caller, this is Webb from Canada. Hello, what's your question for us?
Hi, Marcus and Dale. I just want to say, Marcus, I love your show.
Thank you very much.
My question is along the lines of the Eucharist. First of all, if the two of you could speak to how the Eucharist has changed your faith and helped your faith to grow since receiving the Eucharist. And secondly, how can we as Catholics speak to Protestants regarding the reception of the Eucharist in true form?
Yeah, thank you very much.
For me, it was John chapter 6 which started to point me to the reality of the Eucharist, where Jesus says, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. And what was the response of the people who heard that? They were offended, they were insulted, and they were abhorred, they were appalled. And eventually even some of his own followers left him at that point, who had been believers up until that point. And he was left with just the 12. And he said, are you going to leave too? This is where he's laid it on the line. You have to eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood. It was choice-making time. And Peter said, you have the words of eternal life. We believe. And he's going to stay and follow. And that is a place where people either turn towards the church or against it because of that dogmatic teaching, that this is the body and the blood of Christ. And since Chesterton has something to say about everything, I have to I'm reminded of something he said about the Eucharist. He said, it's one thing to say that Jehovah is an all-pervasive presence in the universe. It's something else to say that Jesus Christ has just entered the room.
You know, even in the earliest days of the church, people struggled with believing in the true presence of Jesus in the host. It was always a struggle. We see that in early church fathers. We see right off the bat some of the early fathers basically saying that you don't base everything just on your senses. And we live in a world where the Humanist Manifesto says that it's really only the things we can touch and see and taste that make any difference. Everything else is to be cast off, which is absurd because there's a lot of important qualities like humility and love that you really can't see. But when I think about how the Eucharist has touched me over the 10 years that I've been a Catholic, I can think about many things, but just quickly I want to say one thing, and that was when I was touched by Catholic spirituality, that again, even in our devotional life says, as you grow in spirituality, you want to wean yourself away from having your spirituality based only on your senses. Because we're talking about a conversion of heart. We're talking about something that involves the soul, which doesn't have feeling per se. It's a different aspect of us. And so that helped me understand more about this Eucharist and how the grace of this receiving of Jesus is touching me in a very powerful way that's hard to discern in our day-by-day sensual experiences. It's something that's much deeper. And so I had to, in my own journey as a convert, I had to keep praying that little prayer, and I think it's John 9, where the Father says, I believe, help my unbelief. Help me grow, help me accept it. And so it's a growing process for many of us. who didn't have the blessing of being brought up from childhood to believe in the reality of the Eucharist. So. But let's take a quick question here, all right? Because I'm not sure about this. This comes from Igor in Connecticut. What was Chesterton influenced by the Fatima events of 1917?
I've never found any references to the Fatima in any of his books, but that doesn't mean he didn't write about it somewhere, because one of the things that the American Chesterton Society is trying to do is gather all his uncollected writings, and it's just an astounding amount of material. There's literally thousands of essays that have never been reprinted. And
as well as probably personal letters and things.
Well, he wrote very few letters after he started really becoming a well-known, because basically all his thoughts were published. Every time he wrote anything, it ended up being published as an article somewhere. And so there's no references to Fatima per se, but there are references to some apparitions and some famous ones. And he talks about Saint Bernadette, for instance.
Well, what's the famous place up in England there?
Walsingham. Yeah, Walsingham. Yeah, and I can't recall anything about Walsingham, but he did talk about.
You said Bernadette, yeah.
Yeah, but he talked about Saint Bernadette, but he also talked about the importance of Mary in English history, and he said that it was once called the Island of Mary. England was. Yeah.
Yeah, well, he has a wonderful The Short History of England,
yes,
which is one that's well worth reading if you can get your hands on. In fact, those of you in England, I don't think it's published here in the States yet, but
yeah, it is. It's in volume 20 of the collected works from Ignatius. It just came out.
There you go. It's available, but I do know that was a Fisher Press, I think.
Fisher Press in England has it.
The Short History of England. It's awesome book. Let's take our next caller. This is Jean from Missouri. Hello. What's your question?
Hello, and thank you, both of you men, for expanding my faith. I have a question about, would you give me the meaning of orthodox and orthodoxy?
Yes.
I'll hang up and let you talk.
Wonderful question.
Good
because
question.
It might be confusing to
Sure.
viewers.
Well, Chesterton, when he uses the term orthodoxy, he says it means the Apostles' Creed. That's what his definition. Anybody who believes that the Apostles' Creed is the definition of the faith, that's the Orthodox faith. And literally what the word means is the straight truth, or the straight reception of the truth. That's what it means. Now, there's also we have the understanding that Eastern Orthodoxy is the Eastern development of the faith that broke away from the Catholic faith in the schism of the 11th century, but that's a slightly different meaning of the term orthodoxy. Okay. But for Chesterton, it's the straight truth.
Yeah, which is interesting. When you on the one hand, we would almost say, well, therefore, I can think of lots of different Christian movements that hold to the Apostles' Creed. It's just that in some cases, it's been a bit of verbal engineering.
Yes.
To redefine what that means.
Yeah.
And so part of what his book is saying this is what it really means.
Right.
This is true orthodoxy according to the Apostles' Creed. You can't just take the creed and then just make it say whatever you want it to say.
Right.
Then it's disconnected from history. Okay, this next email comes from Catherine in Sydney, Australia. Wow, great. Great, you're listening to us. Dear Marcus and Dale, thank you for a most interesting program. A Catholic priest I know told us, in a homily that his vocation early in his seminary years was saved by his reading of The Life of St. Francis by G.K. Chesterton. It is not easy to find this book, and I have been told it is out of print. I also would like to read his Life of St. Thomas Aquinas. Is some printing company like Ignatius Press reprinting this work? Thank you to Dale for your wonderful series on EWTN. God bless you both. Thank you very much, Catherine.
I'm not a paid representative of Ignatius, but I have to plug them once again. Ignatius Press has now a double volume with the St. Thomas and St. Francis books by Chesterton in one volume. But they're also in volume 2 of the collected works. So they're both in print. And tell her to go to our webpage. We'll send something to Australia. We're not afraid of that.
Now, isn't it true? Didn't Sophia Press also do them? I was thinking that they did.
Actually, no. Doubleday, Bantam Doubleday has St. Francis and St. Thomas as separate volumes.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay, they are available.
But they are in print.
You go to bookfinder.com,
Yeah.
and find them used all over the place.
But those are relatively easy books to get a hold of, those two.
Yeah. In libraries, used bookstores often, because especially when a priest dies and his whole library is sold, you can find some of these wonderful books. And
But that used to be the only way you could get most Chesterton was used books. But now that's proof of the Chesterton revival, is that there's probably 70 of his titles back in print now.
Okay.
Incredible.
All right, we've got a question from Maud in Ohio. Hello, what's your question? Hello, Maud. Is Maud there by phone in Ohio? I know it's very cold up in Ohio, but Maud, are you there? I guess.
Yes, hello.
Hello, Maud. Yes, what's your question for us?
Hi. Thank you for taking my call, and I'd like both of you to know that I love your programs, and I like the settings for the Chesterton program very much.
Oh, great. Yeah, they're a lot of fun to watch. It's good.
My question has to do with the book, A Man Called Thursday.
Yes.
I started to read that a long time ago and found it very difficult. And you briefly spoke about it a few times, and I'd just like to know a little bit more. Could you clarify something about what is the object of that, or tell me something about the book? I don't know what to look for.
Thank you, Maud. The Man Who Was Thursday, right?
Yes, and Ignatius Press now has an annotated Man Who Was Thursday. It's probably the only book that Chesterton wrote where he actually wrote some things about the book afterwards, because most of the time when he wrote something, he never referred to it again, but people asked him for some explanations of it, and he wrote some articles, and those essays that he wrote about the book are in that volume from Ignatius. However, the short answer to the question is we've already established tonight that G.K. Chesterton is a great ecumenical writer, that he appeals to many people of different Christian denominations, but he also appeals to non-Christians as well. And there's two things about The Man Who Was Thursday that are very interesting. One, it is an apologetic for ecumenism. It's really about ecumenism, that the fact that someone that you think is against you may be fighting for the same thing that you are once you get underneath their mask. You may assume that they're against you, but it turns out they may be on your side after all, and we can't be too quick to judge them that they're against us. The other thing it's about, and this is the astounding thing, it's about the book of Job. It's about the fact that we're called to suffer for our faith, and that God gives the gift of suffering, and the riddles and the puzzlements, the things that we can't figure out, just as Job could not figure them out. He gives them to his chosen ones, and the best ones. Those are the ones who get the suffering.
You know, just thinking, those of you who have a hard time finding these books, I read The Man Who Was Thursday. I downloaded it onto my little
Your Palm Pilot?
my old Palm Pilot, because it was available free, public domain, at a Palm Pilot site. And so I downloaded the whole book, as well as I've got the whole Father Brown series and a whole bunch of them that I've got on the web. Download them, and I could read them wherever I went. So that's how I read The Man Who Was Thursday. You know, it's a wonderful book, excellent book. Let's try and get this last email in before we take a break, and then we'll come back. It comes from Greg from Omaha. Dear Marcus and Dale, you mentioned that Chesterton and Belloc were against modernism, yet the Holy Father is often considered to be a pope who has reconciled Catholicism with the postmodern world. How do you think Chesterton and Belloc would view John Paul II were they alive today? Thanks, and God bless, Greg, for your question.
The way that the Holy Father has reconciled Catholicism with the postmodern world is that he's told the truth about the Catholic Church, and those from the postmodern world who understand it have been reconciled to it.
Yeah.
Chesterton and Belloc, I think, well, first of all, I know that the Holy Father is a fan of Chesterton.
Yep.
And I know that...
he may not like Belloc's approach, but he would agree.
He'd agree.
See, the problem we've got to make sure we clarify in this email is that we've got to make sure that we're not doing a comparison of apples and oranges in here, because, yes, our Holy Father in many ways has called us of the charitable side of our work with those outside the faith, but he consistently, in all of his writings, tells us not to compromise with the modern world, which John Paul certainly does not. He's not calling us to do that. If he can gather and shake hands with a Muslim, He's not compromising the faith, watering it down, but he's recognizing that we do stand side by side in certain areas. And this issue of orthodoxy, as you mentioned earlier, even in a man who was thirsty, right? You know, when we're on the March for Life, walking down the street, we're walking down the street with a lot of people who aren't Catholics, but we're committed to this cause, which we focus on in our service to the Lord. And I'm sure President Belloc would love John Paul. And
Well,
so much
the
of what he's
fact
written.
that John Paul II has identified and called this the culture of death, Belloc and Chesterton, especially Chesterton, was understanding way ahead of time that that's the battle we're fighting. We are fighting the culture of death, and he was seeing these things before they were happening.
Ooh, the interesting connection too is because right now we are in this culture of death, which one of the fathers of this was the very man that they were fighting against,
H.G.
Wells.
Yes.
They were trying to stop H.G. Wells and what his group was trying to influence. And of course now all our culture remembers is H.G. Wells, who was the father of so much of what's going on today.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Let's take a break. We'll be back just a moment with some final thoughts for the journey home. Dale, how about in closing, I want you to make a comment to the audience about how your reading of Chesterton and also your coming to the Catholic Church has strengthened your faith in Jesus Christ.
Chesterton said that becoming Catholic does not mean leaving off thinking, it means learning how to think. And certainly becoming Catholic and reading Chesterton shows the completeness, the wholeness of the Catholic faith. And the fact that at every step, every aspect of your life, every discipline that you approach, whether it's science or economics, whether it's your daily life, it's all centered on one truth, and that truth is Jesus Christ. It touches everything. Truth is complete. It doesn't have any holes, no weaknesses. Completeness, Marcus.
All right. Excellent summary. Thank you, Dale. Thank you for joining us. And I want to thank you for joining us on the journey home. Next week, our guest will be Father Stephen Anderson, a convert from the Charismatic Episcopal Church. I'll see you then. God bless you.